Hello everyone. All Islamic scholars surely know that in the Quran there are what are called Meccan surahs and Medinan surahs. The way to distinguish them is actually quite easy for those who understand, because there are clear differences in character between the Meccan and Medinan surahs. The Meccan surahs are more poetic, emotional, personal, and peaceful, while the Medinan surahs are more structured, rational, collective, and warlike. The difference in character between the Meccan and Medinan surahs is very drastic, even contradictory, almost as if they were written by two people with opposite personalities. They are called Meccan and Medinan surahs because, according to Islamic tradition, the Meccan surahs were revealed while the Prophet was in Mecca before the Hijrah of 622, and the Medinan surahs were revealed after the Hijrah to Medina in 622. But the problem is, the story of the Prophet's Hijrah only appears more than 100 years after the event supposedly happened, after two dynasties had already risen and fallen. That's extremely late. There is no story about the Hijrah before the Abbasid era, and even the word Hijrah itself was not used to refer to the year before the Abbasids. So, the story of the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina is very questionable. Did it really happen at all? This is compounded by the fact that there are so many hadiths about the Prophet, which raise disputes about whether they are authentic or fabricated. Now, if we ignore the traditional Islamic stories and look only at the Quran, we can ask an interesting question. What if there were actually two Muhammads? What if the Meccan and Medinan surahs really came from two different people? In this video, we will explore that possibility along with the evidence that supports it. As a disclaimer, this is not a study of faith, but an academic inquiry based on the available facts. We are not making claims of truth, but examining possibilities. So make sure to watch this video until the end so you don't misunderstand, okay? Now, let's begin with the differences in character between the Meccan and Medinan surahs, something every scholar already knows. The Meccan surahs are poetic in nature, with repetitive rhythms that make them easy to memorize. You could say Meccan surahs are like song lyrics that stir emotions, the work of someone with an artistic soul. But that artistic quality disappears in the Medinan surahs. The Medinan surahs tend to be prosaic, less imaginative, lacking rhythm, and therefore harder to memorize. They're more like boring product manuals. The next difference is that the Meccan surahs are personal. Their main message is that each individual is responsible for their own fate in the afterlife. Heaven or hell is determined by personal faith and deeds. Anyone can be saved. Meanwhile, the Medinan surahs are collective in nature. They emphasize group identity strongly. Jews are described one way, Christians another. There's a strong in-group versus out-group mentality, us versus them. They will not be pleased with you until you abandon your faith and follow theirs. Group identity becomes very important. Heaven or hell is determined by which group you belong to. Next, the Meccan surahs are more inclusive, while the Medinan surahs are more exclusive. The Meccan surahs often begin with, O mankind, or O children of Adam, giving the impression of a universal message for all people. Usually Meccan verses sound tolerant, peaceful, patient, avoiding conflict. There is no compulsion in religion. To you your religion, and to me mine. Passive in tone. In contrast, the Medinan surahs are addressing a specific group, and their contents contradict the Meccan verses. Commands to wage war, to fight until they pay jizya in submission, to kill unbelievers. Active and intolerant. Simply put, when reading the Quran, one might guess that the verses that respect Jews and Christians are Meccan, while the verses that declare Jews and Christians to be enemies are Medinan. Another difference is that the Meccan surahs are apocalyptic in tone. They warn that the end times are near, using dramatic cosmic imagery, mountains crumbling, stars falling, the earth splitting open. But in the Medinan surahs, which came later, the apocalyptic message fades. Instead of stressing that the end is imminent, they focus on heaven and hell in terms of loyalty to the group, almost as if the day of judgment is still far away, or as if the earlier warnings were forgotten. Heaven in the Medinan surahs is described in material and sensual terms: maidens, rivers of milk and honey, great rewards for fighters. Heaven in the Meccan surahs, on the other hand, is more spiritual, peace and serenity. So there are vast, even opposite differences in character and personality between the Meccan and Medinan surahs. The Meccan surahs sound like the words of a melancholic introvert, emotional, introspective, speaking from a position of weakness, fearful, complaining, gloomy, lingering, holding on to idealistic dreams. The Medinan surahs sound like the words of a choleric extrovert, dominant, aggressive, firm, instructive, authoritative, stressing concrete action. The Meccan surahs contain simple moral messages: do not be arrogant, do not deny, remember the afterlife. The Medinan surahs, by contrast, contain more complex administrative laws: inheritance, marriage, warfare, almsgiving, punishments, and social order.
Now, if you don't believe what I've just explained, you can check it yourself, or ask an ustad whether the drastic differences between the Meccan and Medinan surahs are really as I said. If they not only know how to read in Arabic, but actually understand the Quran, they should confirm what I've said. There's nothing controversial, new, or strange about what I've just presented. It is common knowledge among scholars. So now the question is, do the Meccan and Medinan surahs come from one individual whose personality changed so drastically, or do they actually come from two different individuals? This is something that has never really been discussed because the narrative that they came from one person has been accepted without question. But let us now begin to question it. Is it really possible for such a complete reversal of personality to occur, especially when it is claimed that the Quran comes from Allah? Could Allah change personality? Could Allah, who was once poetic, suddenly become unpoetic, lose his artistic soul, just because the Prophet moved from one place to another? That should not be the case. So now let us set aside faith or the belief that the Quran is the revelation of Allah. Let's look only at the character of the Prophet. The character of the Prophet from whom the Meccan surahs come and the character of the Prophet from whom the Medinan surahs come are vastly different, contradictory, even opposite. In the Meccan surahs, there are no signs of political mastery, legal systems, or systematic theology. Instead, the poetic nature of classical Arabic shows a closeness to literary culture and oral tradition, a culture that prized memorization for transmission. He knows about Jews and Christians, tries to embrace them, but never speaks in detail about their doctrines, suggesting he lived among a traditional, materially religious, and isolated society. He likely came from a lower middle-class background, without formal education, self-taught, and possibly illiterate. But the author of the Medinan surahs has a far more systematic and structured mindset, knowledgeable in politics, law, hierarchy, administration, straightforward, without artistry, and no longer concerned with making the text easy to memorize. This suggests he was not illiterate. In fact, he was likely someone formally educated from an elite family situated within a social and political environment connected to various communities. Now, is it possible for one person to undergo such a drastic change in personality? The answer is possible. Human beings can change. The stories in Islamic sources also somewhat fit. In Mecca, the Prophet was a persecuted minority, but after moving to Medina, he became the leader of a community engaged in wars. A person's style and way of thinking when poor can change after becoming wealthy. But the problem is, here we see a sudden shift in core moral principles, foundational values, and modes of thinking. For example, from holding firmly to the principle of not forcing religion to commanding people to fight until they embrace Islam.
from having an artistic soul that loved poetic language to no longer caring about poetic expression. A change from ordinary man to leader should not erase core principles and inner character, especially not so suddenly. Even traumatic persecution in Mecca should not have altered this completely. There is no logical explanation for this sudden personality change according to the given narrative. There is no sign of transition or admission of change from a personal spiritualist to a political collectivist. There is no narrative like, before I was commanded to peace, but now the situation has changed, so I am commanded to fight. There is no attempt to reconcile the peaceful statements with the warlike ones. The author of the Medinan Surah seems no need to explain why there was once a command for peace and now for war. Everything is abruptly cut off and transformed as if by a different writer altogether. And the new writer seems unaware of what the old writer had written, or does not regard himself as a continuation of the previous one, so he does not feel the need to explain anything from the earlier writings. Therefore, it makes much more sense to conclude that the Meccan and Medinan surahs came from two different individuals, which explains the differences in personality style, the contradictions in principle, the absence of transitional traces in thought, and so on.
Now, the question is there any evidence supporting the idea that the author of the Meccan and Medinan surahs were two different people? Is there any evidence suggesting that there were actually two Muhammads? The answer is yes. There is supporting evidence from non-Islamic historical records, from archaeology, and from Quranic manuscripts. Let's go through them one by one. In the Roman history book, the Chronicle of Theophanes, written in the 9th century, there are records of two Muhammads. The first Muhammad is said to have died in 629-630 CE. This Muhammad was described as the Saracen prophet who had a wealthy wife named Khadija and a follower named Abu Bakr, who later became his successor. It is said that this Muhammad was an orphan, suffered from epilepsy, yet claimed to have met the angel Gabriel during his seizures. His teachings reportedly began to gain popularity in Ethribos, identified as Athribis, an ancient city in Egypt. There is no mention that this Muhammad had many wives, only Khadija. The second Muhammad is said to have been in Smyrna in 671-672 CE. This Muhammad is referred to as Muhammad son of Abdallah. There is no further description about Muhammad bin Abdallah other than that he was in Smyrna. Why did Theophanes write about Muhammad son of Abdallah? We do not know. But one thing is clear. This indicates that he was a famous figure, which is why his name appeared in a historical chronicle. Abdallah, too, was likely well known, or at least recognized by society. Unlike Muhammad, the husband of Khadija, who was only described as an orphan, without any mention of his father's name. The next record is the Heresy of the Ishmaelites by John of Damascus, written in the late 7th or early 8th century. This account is older than any Islamic source, arguably the very first record that clearly mentions Muhammad. John of Damascus does not mention Khadija, Abu Bakr, epilepsy, or any of the details that Theophanes wrote about the first Muhammad. Instead, John of Damascus tells about Muhammad taking the former wife of Zayed. Interestingly, John of Damascus writes as if Muhammad were still alive during his time, or at least not long before. He even instructs Muhammad's followers to ask Muhammad who bore witness to his receiving revelations. So how did John of Damascus know about Muhammad's personal life, such as taking Zayed's wife when, at that time, not a single Islamic source had yet recorded anything about Muhammad? Why did John of Damascus not write about marrying a wealthy widow, epilepsy, and other details? This indicates that the Muhammad John of Damascus knew was not the husband of a wealthy widow, and this Muhammad claimed to receive revelations in dreams, not from an angel. John of Damascus also quoted many Quranic verses to critique them.
The striking point is that the verses he quoted were Medinan verses. So, it is possible that the Muhammad John of Damascus referred to was Muhammad bin Abdallah, the one who took Zayed's wife, who was in Smyrna around 671, and that he was a different person from Muhammad the Saracen prophet, the orphan who married Khadijah. Other supporting evidence comes from archaeology in the form of inscriptions and writings about Muhammad, all of which only appeared and became active after the year 634. Yet by 634, Muhammad should have already died. The first inscription that clearly states that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, had died is a tombstone belonging to a woman named Abasa binti Jurayj, dated to the year 691. Therefore, it is possible that the Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, referred to by John of Damascus, was Muhammad son of Abdullah, who took Zayd's wife, lived in Smyrna around 671, and died around 691. And he was a different person from Muhammad the prophet of the Saracens, the orphan who became Khadijah's husband, and who died around 630.
What other evidence do we have? Evidence from the Quranic manuscripts themselves. In Islamic history, there are 3 events of Quranic standardization. The first by Abu Bakr, the second by Uthman, and the third by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. Muslims today believe that the Quran we have now is exactly the same as the one standardized by Uthman. But the problem is, we don't have any manuscripts of the Quran that were supposedly standardized by Uthman. In fact, we don't even have a complete Quranic manuscript written before the Abbasid dynasty, which began in 750 CE. What we do have from the 7th century are only fragments or portions of the Quran. What's interesting is this. In all manuscripts dated before 650, only Meccan surahs appear. Meanwhile, manuscripts from after 650 up until 700 are dominated by Medinan surahs, with only a few Meccan ones. The only exception is the Sana manuscript from the late 7th century, which contains a mix of both Meccan and Medinan surahs, though even that is incomplete. After 700, more and more Meccan surahs begin to appear gradually until around 750. The oldest Quranic manuscript that most closely resembles the Quran we have today is the Topkapi manuscript, written during the Abbasid dynasty after 750. The facts about the evolution of these manuscripts preserved in museums support the conclusion that there were actually 2 Muhammads. The first Muhammad, an orphan of unknown parentage, who married Khadijah and wrote the Meccan surahs. He was not born in Mecca and then migrated to Medina, but most likely born in Petra, later gaining many followers in Athribis, Egypt, and died around 630. We can call this first Muhammad the Saracen prophet. After his death, the second Muhammad appeared, the son of Abdullah, a well-known figure who married Zayed's former wife and wrote the Medinan surahs. He probably lived in a city called Medina, but not the Medina that is now in Saudi Arabia, rather a different Medina that is now located in Iraq. He was in Smyrna in 671 and died around 691. We can call this second Muhammad the Prophet of Islam. While the second Muhammad was alive, what people called the Quran and commonly used consisted mainly of the Medinan surahs. After his death around the 690s, during the reign of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, the Dome of the Rock was built, Islamic coins with Arabic inscriptions appeared, and the 2 phrases of the Shahada began to be used. Only after the second Muhammad died did people begin to search for, rediscover, and add the Meccan surahs into the Quran, which until then had mostly contained only the Medinan surahs. This addition of the Meccan surahs didn't happen all at once, but gradually until 750, when it was finalized by the Abbasid dynasty. That's why in today's Quran, the earlier sections are dominated by the Medinan surahs, the middle is a mixture, and the later sections are dominated by Meccan surahs.
In the 8th century, during the Abbasid period, the story of a single Muhammad was created by Ibn Ishaq as a tale for the children of Caliph al-Mansur. Ibn Ishaq's tale was later revised by Ibn Hisham a century later in the 9th century. And by the 9th century, popular folk stories about Muhammad, whether the first or the second, emerged and, influenced by certain political and religious interests, eventually formed the basis of various hadiths. This explains why some hadiths are considered authentic, others fabricated, and some even contradictory. The idea of there being two Muhammads explains how this situation came to be. One set of hadiths describes the first Muhammad, while another set describes the other Muhammad. Even today, scholars have minor disagreements about whether certain surahs belong to the Meccan or Medinan period. Broadly speaking, there are 82 surahs that most scholars agree are Meccan, and 20 surahs that most agree are Medinan. There are 12 surahs still disputed, including Surah Al-Fatiha. Some scholars even argue that Al-Fatiha is not part of the Quran at all. To me, this indicates that there may have been more than two individuals involved in writing the Quran, beyond the two Muhammads we have discussed in this video. The two Muhammads we focused on are simply the two who contributed the most to the Quran. The first Muhammad, the Saracen prophet, the orphan, Khadijah's husband, author of the Meccan surahs. The second Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, the son of Abdullah, husband of Zainab, author of the Medinan surahs. So what do you think? Is it more reasonable to believe that the Quran is a revelation from one Allah to a single Muhammad who underwent a change in personality due to migration? Or is it more reasonable to believe that the Quran is the work of two different individuals with different personalities, living in different times and places? Please write your answers in the comments of this video. That's all for this video. See you in the next one.